Good morning. We're beginning week number 10 of our daily Staying Rooted exercise, where we are using the writings of John Newton, the 1700s slave ship captain who was radically converted to a follower of Jesus and became a pastor and leader and spiritual mentor to many, along with the Psalms, to help us stay rooted in the midst of uncertain times. And so I'm working my way through this letter that John Newton wrote about the purpose of the law of God. And he makes this comment. He says, we use the law lawfully, or we use it rightly, when we use it as a glass to behold the glory of God. A glass, like a looking glass or a telescope, to bring the greatness and the wonder of God closer to it. That's how we use, one of the ways in which we use the law rightly, when we use it as a glass to behold the glory of God. And it got me thinking, is how much value do I place on being able to see more clearly the glory and the wonder and the majesty of God? Because in the psalm that I've been listening to, Psalm 119, kind of working section by section through this longest psalm in the Bible, the section today deals with a couple of things that the psalmist says the glory of God seen through his law is far more important than. For example, in verse 72, it says, "The law of your mouth is better to me than thousands of gold and silver pieces." It's better than gold and silver. Verse 69, the psalmist says, "The insolent smear me with lies, but with my whole heart I keep your precepts." The law of God is worth more to him than the opinion of men and the views of him that other people have. In verse 67 and verse 71, he talks about affliction. He says in verse 67, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word." And then in verse 71, he says, "It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes." So he's saying that the beauty of God seen through the law of God is far more important to him than whatever comfort or health was taken away because of these afflictions that he's suffering. And then I glance back at the section just before, and it says in verse 62, "At midnight I rise to praise you because of your righteous rules." Now, whether this is because he has insomnia or he just decided to wake up in the middle of the night to praise God, obviously the glory of God seen through the law of God is more important to him at that particular moment than sleep. Now, what's interesting as you consider these things is none of the things that he is talking about giving up are bad things. Resources, financial resources, gold and silver, not bad in itself. Certainly, one's good reputation among other people is not a bad thing in itself. In fact, in certain ways, we're told to seek a good reputation among others. Affliction, physical comfort, and our health, they're not bad things in and of themselves. Right? Sleep, definitely not a bad thing in and of itself. Very necessary, very important, probably undervalued by many of us today. Very important. And yet none of these things are worth keeping or holding on to if it means that we sacrifice because of them a clearer view of the glory of God seen through the law of God. And it isn't so much, I don't think, because we see these things too greatly. In other words, we think that money or health or the opinion of others or sleep, that we think of them too greatly. It's that we think of the beauty of God too smallly. We don't think of God as great enough to surpass the goodness of these other things. I was listening to an interview with a pretty well-known pastor, and the interviewer asked him a question. This was last week. I was listening to this interview. The interviewer asked him a question and said, "What was one of the hardest seasons in your life in pastoral ministry?" And he responded by saying, "Well, it was a period after we had a pretty significant incident, major tragedy in the city where where my church is located. And in the years after that," he said, "a number of things happened." He said, "I got cancer, from which he's recovered now." He said, "But I got cancer. My wife had to have several major surgeries, and because of that, I had to be much less connected with the day-to-day operations of the church, and my staff began to resent my absence. It caused all kinds of interpersonal conflict. So terrible situation. Physical health of his wife was affected. His physical health was affected. The health of his church leadership staff was affected. And he says, I look back at it now. He says, I wouldn't trade it at all. I wouldn't trade it. None of those things were good. The loss of health, the infighting and discontent of his staff. None of those things were good. He said, but I wouldn't trade it because through it all, God used it to draw me closer to him and have a deeper, richer appreciation for the glory of God today than I ever would have had those things not happened. Now, that's a hard kind of truth to think about if you're thinking about, should I be asking for those things? God, send affliction, send sleeplessness, send bad reports of me among others. Well, we shouldn't ask for those things as if those things are good, but we should, with trembling, I think, at some level, ask God to do whatever it takes to give us a clearer vision of who he is. And here's the promise. We actually don't need to worry about whether we kind of, cause those things to happen in our lives. We shouldn't. We're not in charge of those things. God will bring them if God deems them to be necessary, and we can trust God in doing so because, as the psalmist says, you are good and you do good. Verse 68, Psalm 119, verse 68. You are good and you do good. And so because of that, we can trust that whatever God chooses to allow us to see a greater, clearer vision of his glory will be a good thing. And even if that period brings struggle or affliction, we can view it with thanksgiving because we know that God's ultimate aims are good. Have a great day.